lesson we were looking at modern liberalism and how modern liberalism sought to create justice that was left out of classical liberalism. So it sought to make it so that everybody has equality of opportunity, where people have a good standard of living, which means that when they're not poor and they're not suffering from poverty, they're able to actually aspire to fulfill themselves as individuals. But have we actually completely discarded classical liberal ideas? So do we live in a modern liberal society, or have we moved back to the ideas of classical liberalism? And this picture here is a picture of 4 prime ministers and their wives at the funeral of Margaret Thatcher. So you have Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, John Major and David Cameron. And they're here at the funeral of Margaret Thatcher. And the reason why I've put this picture here is they actually all, in some ways, represent the ideas of classical liberalism, but in a new form. And that new form was brought about from Margaret Thatcher. And even after her death, those ideas are still dominant in British society today. So this idea of liberalism, this is essentially what happened, So you had modern liberalism, which advocated the economics of John Maynard Keynes. And what had actually happened was Margaret Thatcher came into power and essentially destroyed all of those Keynesism ideas and essentially said, we shouldn't be giving out too many benefits because that makes people lazy. We shouldn't be encouraging companies to go bust and bailing them out because then that's going to essentially make it so that the losers are winning in society. So she comes in and she says, we shouldn't have this much state intervention. We should be moving away from state intervention and moving towards a laissez-faire state again. And this is called neoliberalism, and it's a counter-revolutionary idea. And it's counter-revolutionary because it's reversing the change of big government in post-war years. So we had before in the 19th century, we had laissez-faire and limited government under classical liberalism, where the government just does not get involved. The only thing the government really does is protect people's property, essentially. That's it, just leaving it down to life, liberty and property, that's it. So modern liberalism said that created too many inequalities. It meant that people didn't have the opportunity to fulfill themselves as individuals. So they had a more interventionist government supporting the ideas of Keynesianism, which is like a mixed economy where it's a bit state-owned and a bit privatised as well. And then after that, you have Margaret Thatcher, who comes in and reverses these radical changes after the Second World War and brings Britain back to a more individualistic way of running as a state. So the state is absolutely limited. The only thing so she's actually a neoliberal, but she's also a neoconservative. And the conservative part of that is the idea of being tough on crime. So tough, like the ideas of law and order, the idea of harshly punishing people if they break the law because human beings are innately bad. So that's kind of the slight nuance in her in terms of why she's not she's kind of a neoliberal in terms of the economy, but in terms of her principles and her view on human nature, which is extremely negative, that makes her a neoconservative. So neoliberalism then is the end of the post-war consensus. And what does that look like? And this is a clip from Margaret Thatcher on Prime Minister's questions.
I give way to the honourable gentleman.
There is no doubt that the Prime Minister has in many ways achieved substantial success in the economy. There is one statistic that I understand is not, however, challengeable, and that is that over her 11 years, the gap between the richest 10% and the poorest 10% in this country has widened substantially.
That's right.
How can she say at the end of her chapter of British politics that she can justify many people in a constituency such as mine being relatively much poorer off, much less well housed, and much less well provided than it was in 1979? Surely she accepts that is not a record that she or any Prime Minister can be proud of.
Mr. Speaker, all levels of income are better off than they were in 1979. But what the honourable member is saying is that he would rather the poor were poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That way you will never create the wealth for better social services as we have. And what a policy! Yes, he would rather have the poor poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That is the Liberal policy. Yes, it came out, he didn't intend it to, but he did. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm extremely grateful. The Prime Minister is aware that I detest every single one of her domestic policies, and I've never hid that.
And I think that the honourable gentleman knows that I have the same contempt for his socialist policies as the people of East Europe who have experienced it have it for theirs. I think I must have hit the right nail on the head when I pointed out that the logic of those policies are they'd rather have the poor poorer. Once they start to talk about the gap, they'd rather the gap was that. Down here. That. Not that. But that. So long as the gap is smaller, so long as the gap is smaller, they'd rather have the poor poorer. You do not create wealth and opportunity that way. You do not create a property-owning democracy that way.
So you can see there, the context of when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister was the Cold War. And you can see that she attributes any form of state intervention as being the same as the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, although she's very careful to say socialist and not communist, because she's trying to essentially expand the negative connotations of communism to include socialism too. So she's essentially acknowledging that she thinks that you shouldn't, in her words, cap people who have worked hard. You shouldn't have heavy taxation on the rich, because then that's going to be a disincentive for them making as much money as possible. We should prioritise those people. So under Margaret Thatcher, a lot of new money started to be formed in terms of investment bankers, people like that, and they were nicknamed yuppies as well. And the idea of neoliberalism then was actually created in 1938 by somebody called Friedrich Hayek from Austria. And essentially they were looking at the rise of social democracy, and they were horrified by it. They looked at Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, and they looked at the way that Britain's welfare state was beginning to grow, and they were horrified by that because they saw it as collectivism. And they saw that as the same thing that the Nazis were doing and the same thing that the communists were doing. And it essentially became this idea that socialism, collectivism, or state intervention was an infringement on the freedom of the individual, because you're essentially being taxed heavily, but also you're being somewhat nannied or mothered, very sexist words to use, but that's kind of the terminology. But the idea that you're being forced to go to school, you're being forced to go to college, and so forth. So it's essentially this idea that we need to just give individuals back their responsibility to make their own choices. And it's not about maximising their ability to make the choices. They need to just work harder. They need to be rugged individuals. So one of the things that she privatised, for example, was BT, which was formerly owned by the British government, and she privatised that. And I'll put a link to a documentary for you to watch to try and get a better understanding of the changes that Margaret Thatcher made in the UK. So neoliberalism then has been heavily criticised, and one of the best books to read as a criticism, or it's actually a documentary, maybe it's better just to watch a documentary, is The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. And she essentially looks at how neoliberalism became the dominant ideology in the world today, and it still is a dominant ideology. It's still the status quo is neoliberalism. It's not modern liberalism, it's not socialism, it's neoliberalism. And essentially, Jeremy Corbyn was a counter to that. He tried to have another revolution against this counter-revolution, but obviously he completely failed. So in terms of the Shock Doctrine, Naomi Klein essentially investigates the birth of neoliberalism. She looks at Margaret Thatcher, she looks at Milton Friedman, her idol, and she looks at Hayek and these ideas. And she essentially looks at how it has been implemented into society. And it starts off with Chile And that's because they orchestrated a hostile takeover of the Chilean government. So that is a British democracy and an American democracy essentially taking over another country to implement neoliberalism. It's a fantastic documentary, very, very sad though, and I think it definitely changed my worldview when I watched it, and it's very well evidenced as well. So 21st century liberalism, the idea is that Francis Fukuyama wrote in the 90s, after the collapse of at the end of the Cold War and the collapse of communism, he wrote that this is the end of history. So to him, liberalism was the only answer, the only dominant ideology around the world, and it is considered to be the final solution to the problem of political organisation. And is that true? Is this the end? Are there going to be no more ideologies? Is socialism never going to come back and be popular again? Is collectivism dead? Is it all about privatisation? And we're definitely seeing increased privatisation in terms of our schools. Even though it's still state funded, they are now privately run. In terms of hospitals as well, again, still state funded, but private companies are taking over more and more of the NHS services. And both of these reforms actually were done by Tony Blair. Tony Blair was the first person to start privatising the NHS. He was also the person who made it so that schools became academies, which are effectively private organisations funded by the state. So that's how far neoliberalism has infiltrated even the Labour Party. So is this it? Is this the end of history, or are there more ideologies coming? And I think, as we've probably seen very recently, Fukuyama has egg on his face in the sense that it's definitely not the end of history. History is still going on. Our society is constantly being challenged, and that's been very much intensified in the recent weeks.